The current era of global politics has often been described as a return to the days of great power competition. But while this is usually taken to mean competition between the United States and other rising powers, it's worth remembering that a major war could just as easily break out between two countries much closer together, China and Russia. While leaders of the two countries have stressed their close friendship for years, the truth is a bit more complicated. While they both have autocratic governments opposed to the Western-led international order, in reality, there are many points of contention in the China-Russia relationship, any number of which could potentially lead to a conflict. But what would a war between these two vast countries actually look like? Who would have the upper hand? And what would it mean for the rest of the world? To answer these questions, we first need to take a look back at the way Chinese-Russian relations developed. Their shared modern history began in the earliest days of the Cold War, with the 1949 victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union quickly moved to become a patron of the new country, seeing it as a critical junior partner in the broader Cold War. This was formalized in 1950, as Mao and Stalin signed the so-called Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This treaty strengthened the two countries' geopolitical relationship on political, military, and economic levels, including a loan from the USSR of over $300 million. However, the two countries' relationship began to deteriorate soon afterwards, leading to the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s. This followed several years where China worked with a large number of Soviet advisors who encouraged the Chinese leaders to follow the Russian model of development with an emphasis on heavy industry, funded by taxes and levies from the peasantry, whilst making consumer goods a low priority. When Stalin died in 1953, Mao felt he was now the senior leader and was resentful when the new Soviet leaders Malenkov and Khrushchev did not recognize him as such. Mao had ignored many of Stalin's requests, but he had respected him as a world leader and symbol of communism. But in 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin during his secret speech, and although Mao didn't react publicly to the news, he was privately infuriated. Tensions continued to build through 1959, when Khrushchev held a summit meeting with US President Dwight Eisenhower. The Soviets were alarmed by developments within China and sought to appease the West. They also refused to honor their earlier commitment to help China develop nuclear weapons and support Mao in his border dispute with China. Mao was offended by these actions. He felt Khrushchev was being far too accommodating to Western demands. However, the Soviet leadership were well aware that the Americans could match or exceed their nuclear capabilities, and they sought to engage the US in strategic dialogue and negotiations aimed at avoiding the outbreak of war. For much the same reason, the Soviet leadership became determined not to give Mao nuclear weapons. By June 1960, the split between Russia and China became public when Khrushchev and Peng Zhen openly clashed. During 1962, international events caused the final split between the Soviet Union and China. Mao criticized Khrushchev for backing down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev responded by declaring that Mao's policies would lead to nuclear war. By 1965, the Sino-Soviet split was an established fact, and the start of Mao's Cultural Revolution severed all contact between not only the two countries, but between China and most of the rest of the world. As late as 1970, Mao realized that he could not simultaneously confront the Soviet Union, United States, and suppress internal disorder. Mao decided that because of their geographical proximity, the Soviets were a greater threat, and so he decided to open a dialogue with America and so confront the USSR. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger made a secret visit to Beijing to make the arrangements for a visit by President Nixon in the following year. The Soviets retaliated by organizing their own summit with Nixon. This paved the way to creating a triangular relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, ending the worst period of confrontation between the USSR and China. Today, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Russia and China maintain a complex relationship with a different set of tensions. But despite the declarations of friendship from both sides, the outbreak of war between them is always a possibility. And unlike the days of the Sino-Soviet split, Moscow wouldn't have the upper hand. China's enormous economic and military growth in the past 3 decades, and Russia's loss of most of its Soviet territory and human capital has drastically shifted the balance of power between the two. Today, China's economy is more than 3.5 times the size of Russia's, while its military is both more modern and better funded. Another major point of contention is far east of Russia, which many of the country's politicians believe has become part of China's sphere of influence. Declining Russian population and a failure to build infrastructure in the region since the end of the USSR has increased this trend further, especially as they have been replaced with Chinese immigrants and foreign investment. Similarly, Chinese interest in the region's extensive energy resources has dramatically increased in recent years as the superpower's economic growth has begun to slow. A final point of contention between China and Russia has to do with the sale and manufacture of weapons. For decades, China was among the most reliable buyers of Soviet weaponry, but today, the country has developed its own extensive defense industry, in no small part due to espionage by Chinese agents, who have stolen plans for classified Russian technology for years. In some instances, being caught red-handed. China has also violated many of its licensing agreements with Russia around fighter aircraft and other technology, building its own without continuing to buy engines and electronic systems from Russia. Given these trends, there are several major flashpoints between the two nations which could theoretically turn very ugly very fast. When it comes to a military showdown between the two powers, the scales have also tilted more and more firmly in favor of China. While Russian nuclear weapons and overall equipment stockpiles have long kept it as one of the foremost military powers, in recent years, estimates of the country's basic competency, availability of equipment, tactical effectiveness, and leadership have all come under serious question. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown that its armed forces are barely capable, and that they are far more suited for conflicts against weak forces like Syrian rebel groups. Up against even a small amount of NATO weaponry and support, Russian forces have fared disastrously. And while China's hardware is still nowhere near as advanced as that of NATO, there is good reason to believe that it would now outstrip Russia in any sort of direct military engagement. But Russia's recent failures have also cast doubt on the effectiveness of Chinese forces, especially since they have not fought an active war this century. And even back in 1979, China was militarily defeated by Vietnam, a far smaller country already exhausted from decades of war. While China claimed victory in the conflict, it failed to achieve its primary objective of preventing Vietnam from overthrowing the genocidal Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge government in neighboring Cambodia. While China's capabilities have grown enormously since then, and its military doctrine has been updated and modeled off of that of the US, the current forces are largely untested in battle. In one major way, this gives China a different problem from Russia, which has a military with substantial combat experience, but hopelessly outdated doctrine and equipment. And in a head-to-head contest between the two countries, China seems to have a definite advantage. But some experts have speculated that below the surface, its defense sector may have just as many issues. For instance, corruption in China may run just as deeply as in Russia, a problem which only came to light during President Xi Jinping's corruption purges in the late 2010s. Yet such purges were also more of a political tool than anything else, and likely did little to fix the root of the problem. So in a theoretical Chinese-Russian war, both sides would likely suffer from corruption and poor resource management. Similarly, the defenses on both sides, particularly Russia, would quickly become an issue. Russian air defenses have long been vaunted as among the most advanced in the world, but the war in Ukraine again cast doubt on this claim. Using drones, Ukraine has been able to penetrate Russian air defenses on numerous occasions, striking deep inside the country at military bases, command and control centers, and even cities. China has far more drones than Ukraine, suggesting that it could overwhelm Russian air defenses with relative ease. However, the reverse is also possible, as Russia still maintains a large stockpile of missiles capable of reaching Chinese cities, as well as numerous Iranian-manufactured drones. However, missiles and drones aside, it's clear that in a conflict, China would have a definite advantage in terms of funding, personnel, and overall capability. So how might such a war actually play out? On the ground, there would likely be skirmishes along most of the Russian-Chinese border, while sparsely populated Mongolia, which sits sandwiched between the two powers, would likely become a major avenue of attack. In the event of a Chinese invasion, Mongolia would provide a perfect staging ground to attack and seize land in the vulnerable Russian east. While Russia has historically kept substantial forces in the area to deter such an attack, the war in Ukraine has forced Putin to pull nearly all his available troops to the European border, leaving the south and east quite exposed to any attacks. China, on the other hand, has been able to maintain its forces along the Russian and Mongolian borders, giving it a distinct advantage on the ground. That's not to mention that the Chinese armed forces are far more numerous than Russia's, with almost double the active duty forces. And while numbers aren't everything, it seems likely that a Chinese ground attack on the south and east of Russia would be able to capture and hold large swathes of territory. However, one area where Russia would still have something of an advantage is in the air. The Russian Air Force, or VKS, has long been viewed as one of the world's most formidable, with a large fleet of reliable planes and even a number of next-gen fighter jets such as the Sukhoi Su-57, which utilizes stealth technology and advanced avionics. While China's fleet of fighter jets is more numerous, with over 1,200 aircraft to Russia's 750, there is little doubt that Russia would have a qualitative edge in the skies. Even so, the war in Ukraine has once again cast doubt on supposedly superior Russian capabilities, as the country has failed to establish air superiority at any stage of its invasion. As the UK Ministry of Defence recently noted, this reality has made it extremely difficult for Russian forces to take any new territory, as the lack of air support has led to repeated failures to break a Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnipro River. In a conflict with a country as large and powerful as China, Russia would almost certainly be even more hard-pressed to field effective air support. This is especially true today, as Western sanctions from the invasion of Ukraine have made it impossible for Russia to obtain the components needed to produce more advanced fighters. China, while not on the best terms with Western states, does not suffer from the same level of crippling sanctions on its aerospace or broader defense industries. On the Chinese side, one major challenge in an offensive against Russia would be its comparative lack of tanker aircraft, limiting the ability of its air force to refuel near the front lines. Another area where Russia would historically have had a major advantage is in ground-based air defenses. Under Vladimir Putin's decades-long rule, Russia has continually upgraded its air defense systems, many of which are designed to fight off the far more powerful US Air Force. Until 2022, it was widely presumed that Russian air defenses, especially newer systems like the S-400 and S-500, could handle almost anything thrown at them. But on numerous occasions, they failed miserably against Ukrainian drone and missile attacks, in what the US-based Institute for the Study of War has called a systematic tactical failure, which suggests that Russian forces were unprepared to intercept missiles with the system or were unable to do so. Similarly, scholars from US Air University recently wrote that Russia continued to suffer from a strategic priority on defensive over offensive operations, failure to develop sufficient capacity and capability for operations at this scale, and comparatively immature operational concepts. As a result, Russian air defenses have failed to stop numerous Ukrainian strikes deep inside the country. In a potential conflict with China, this failure would likely be compounded, and there is good reason to believe that China could overwhelm Russian air defenses in most parts of the country. On the other hand, China's air defense systems are largely untested, so there is significant debate about their capabilities. However, as the RAND Corporation pointed out several years ago, Chinese systems are now advanced enough that they would pose a serious challenge even to the US. As they note, in 1996, the vast majority of China's 500-plus long-range surface-to-air missile systems were Chinese duplicates of the obsolete Russian SA-2 missile. By 2010, China had deployed roughly 200 launchers for double-digit SAMs. The newer missiles have more sophisticated seekers and ranges of up to 200 kilometers. Combined with more capable fighter aircraft and the addition of a new airborne warning and control system, the Chinese Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) has become a formidable obstacle. Given assessments like this, it's very possible that Chinese air defense systems now outstrip those of Russia. And in any military contest between the two powers, victory would likely come down to both control of the skies and resources to maintain that control. On a broader level, the development and maintenance of military technology would also be a major factor in a war between China and Russia. While both countries are at a general level of technological parity, they do differ significantly in their industrial bases and ability to produce more. China's economy is far larger, at $26.8 trillion to Russia's $4 trillion, a factor that would give it a substantial advantage in any drawn-out military engagement. Due to many of these factors, Russia's main chance at victory in such a war would be to utilize the element of surprise, as well as its asymmetric capabilities, such as the Wagner Group and other PMC groups with combat experience. But if Russia failed to secure large early gains, it's very likely that the balance of power would shift towards China, given its superior resources, manpower, and global connections. But in the end, the reality is that a fight between China and Russia would have no real winner. It would almost certainly be dragged down into a brutal and widespread war of attrition with enormous destruction and potentially millions of civilian casualties. While China would certainly have the upper hand, we should always remember that any such contest would undoubtedly be a disaster for much of our modern world. But what do you think? Would Russia be able to hold off a Chinese attack, or would China's military and economic might overwhelm a sanctioned and faltering Russian military? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.